Hello and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. Today we're going to take a look at the botanical species Schlumbergera Orssichiana. Unfortunately, this species is listed as endangered according to IUCNRedlist.org. It grows in Brazil around Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo. It says that the upper elevation limit is 2,000 meters, lower elevation limit 1,000 meters. However, I have seen reports of much lower elevations than that. They did indicate that it was only found in 3 locations, growing in subtropical to tropical moist montane forests. Specifically, it's found growing in a park there. And this is really interesting because it's the first time that I've ever heard of this kind of threat to a species. In the park where it's growing, it's really, really commonly visited by locals, and they collect firewood. And so apparently, when they're collecting the firewood, if they happen to see this plant in flower, a lot of times they take it because it's beautiful. I mean, look at it. The locals probably have no idea that it's endangered. When I was a child, kind of a young teenager, we used to have this beautiful yellow flower that would grow kind of sparsely here and there in like bogs and stuff around where I lived. And we used to dig that up and transplant it and try to get it to grow in flower beds near the house. And it's not endangered, but I mean, maybe it could have been. I mean, it wasn't, but you know what I'm saying. So it's just not something that I think that people consciously think about that much, but maybe we should think about it a little bit more. Schlumbergera orssichiana was first described, I believe it was in 1978. And in plant terms, that's actually fairly recent. So sometimes when a plant is first described, it was collected from the wild. Sometimes it was found growing in a botanical garden. Sometimes it was found growing in a private garden. Sometimes it was actually even found mass cultivated already, so like it was distributed to the masses and then described afterwards. That is not the case with Schlumbergera orssichiana though. It can take a very long time to get a species into cultivation when it's collected from a single source. Usually when it's collected from a single source, it lands itself in a botanical garden and maybe a few botanist hands. From there, it has to either get from the botanical garden or the botanist hands into hobbyist hands. After all of that happens, some hobbyists, and even some botanists, are hybridizers. So I would say in about the last 15 to 20 years, Schlumbergera orssichiana has been used very heavily in hybridizing. The most famous one is probably the hybrid Madame Butterfly variegated. Now, Madame Butterfly also had Schlumbergera orssichiana genetics. However, it didn't have the same collector value as the variegated one, so it didn't quite get distributed in the same way. I think this species exploded Schlumbergera hybridizing in the most fascinating way. I think that there are some really trademark characteristics of this species. One, the fact that it has much larger clades than any of the other botanical species. It is a pendant, like obviously you can see how it's hanging down. That can be a pro and a con in some ways. Like in some ways, it's kind of difficult because if you want to hang it in your house, you can see the flowers, but you're always kind of seeing the outside of the flowers. And so to get like a proper view of the flowers, it has to be above your head. So it can be kind of a pro and kind of a con. Added to that, the flowers are humongous. They are by far the largest flowers of any of the botanical Schlumbergera species. That also lends to the fact that they're very heavy and they pull the branches down, which again, the best view of this plant is from the bottom looking up. The large flowers is something that was carried through genetically to a lot of the hybrids, and actually some of the hybrids, the flower size vastly exceeds the botanical species flower size. The most famous one that I can think of is the hybrid Frony. You can see the size difference in a comparison here with just some standard Schlumbergera and even a generic sort of Acremanii-ish Daiso cactus hybrid. It is crazy huge. The flowers are also hooded. So the flower petals, they form kind of a hood around the stamen and the stigma. And that became a very, very interesting addition when it came to hybridizing. Because as we remember, like they're the old Buckley type hybrids, which contained genetics from Orssichiana and Schlumbergera truncata. And those types of hybrids, they tended to have flowers that were more symmetrical, and the petals did not curve back in a strong way, whereas that's something that is a common trait for Schlumbergera truncata hybrids and not necessarily something that most people like. Some people do, but most people do not really like that appearance. So when these hooded flowers got thrown into the mix, those genetics carry through and they tend to make flowers that do not reflex backward like that. In my experience, my plants with Orssichiana genetics and the species itself tend to bloom 3 times annually. The major blooming period tends to be September, October. So I'm really, really vying for the common name of these to become Halloween cactus. I don't think that's going to happen, though. They do have some other common names already. So they are commonly called queens. And the, I guess, recognized hybrid type of these is Reginiae. The other times that I see mine bloom are later in the winter and in the spring. The other thing that is really characteristic about this species is the flower bud itself. It tends to have a lot more petals and they're of varying sort of widths. And so some of them are really kind of thin, but it seems a lot more intricate, a lot more fairy tale-like. That characteristic tends to carry over in the hybrids containing this species' genetics. As seen here on the hybrid Samba Queen, the pollen parent was Schlumbergera Orssichiana and the pod parent was Schlumbergera truncata. It was a cultivated variety that was yellow. The hybridizer was Rude Tropper. You can see so many of the genetic traits of Schlumbergera Orssichiana, but what's interesting is that you can also see the plant overall has more of an upright habit, which is more indicative of Schlumbergera truncata. As the genetics get more and more watered down, like as you take a Schlumbergera Orssichiana hybrid and you keep on crossing it with Schlumbergera truncata hybrids, the genetics are obviously going to get more watered down. For me personally, I do find that Schlumbergera Orssichiana is the easiest botanical species to grow, and it is even easier than Schlumbergera truncata. For whatever mysterious reason, I think that the hybrids aren't so hard to grow of truncata, but the actual species are considerably harder than the hybrids. I don't really notice the same kind of dramatic clade drop if you make a little bit of a watering mistake. It seems like it has to be kind of a big watering mistake for it to have the same effect. It grows very quickly, flowers very easily. Truly just simple care, the same as the Schlumbergera truncata hybrids. It's in my standard epiphytic cacti mix. It's in this 3-inch ceramic pot, and I use the ceramic pots because of the weight. You can see that this little plant is not really that little for that size of a pot. The plant is at a stage where I could pot it up into like a 6-inch hanging basket. Truly the only real dramatics I have with this particular species is the chipmunk that keeps trying to nibble on its phylloclades. In terms of fertilizer, I use hydroponic fertilizer these days, the FloraGrow series, equal parts. I give them very low doses. It's like 200 ppm per watering. I never stop. I never take a break. I don't do any kind of strange dry spell. I do think that they probably get a little bit more of a natural dry spell just because I grow them outdoors through the warm months. But when they move in for the winter time, I do have to decrease the watering only because it takes them longer to dry out. So I'm not forcibly trying to reduce the watering. It's just that indoors, because it don't have the same kind of airflow and everything, the water does not evaporate as quickly. So they just don't need as many waterings. I supplement with Cali Magic, which is just a liquid nutrient that has some calcium and magnesium, which most fertilizers are kind of deficient in. In terms of flowering, I just let nature do its thing. So because I keep them outside, as the temperature drops or as the day lengths start getting shorter, it will naturally trigger bud development. That same thing will happen indoors on a windowsill, though. It may just happen a little bit later. In terms of obtaining this species, I obtained this species from Jay Vivini, who sells on eBay sometimes. I purchased a cutting of it, and while the cutting was a little on the expensive side, because I collect species, botanical species particularly, like it was, something that I was willing to pay. I think that there are other ways of obtaining it, though. I think if you are in other countries, I would really, really strongly recommend looking at Facebook. Just looking at the different Facebook groups and, doing an in search of request on there, because this species is a lot more prolific now in cultivation, so it's not the hardest thing to collect. There are also multiple different clones. My clone obviously has some very, very vibrant pink flowers, and that can be altered by just temperature changes, by sunlight, by fertilizer. There's all kinds of things that can actually impact the intensity of the flower colors. So from one year to the next, they might not always be exactly the same shade of pink. And with the clones, you see a lot of shade variation. Some of them are very light pink, some of them are very dark pink. In terms of the hybrids of these, you can use Schlumbergera.net to try to find the different hybrids that might be available that have Schlumbergera Orssichiana genetics. You can also go on the Facebook groups. I cannot stress enough, to go check out the different Facebook groups, because there's so much excitement going on with Schlumbergera hybridizing these days that almost every hour I'm seeing crazy, beautiful, insane hybrids. There are double flowering queen hybrids. There are some that have just the most remarkable sunset type shades of color. I mean, truly, there's some really fantastic, crazy things happening in Schlumbergera hybridization. It's no longer just your grandmother's Christmas cactus or the Thanksgiving cactus that you see in the big box stores. There are truly crazy, crazy things happening in hybridization. If you're in the United States and you're looking to purchase queen hybrids, I highly recommend checking out Witten Greenhouses. They have several cultivars. I would also highly recommend looking at Facebook. And this one is international, not just the United States. There are many sellers on Facebook. There are many groups dedicated to selling. You just want to be careful about scams and stuff like that. But for the most part, if you go into the communities and you ask around and stuff, it's pretty safe. I hope you've enjoyed looking at Schlumbergera Orssichiana with me. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy cacti growing.